Eid Mubarak to all those who are celebrating. It's Monday night here in India. It's good to be back in the studio. Tonight we are focusing on India's China challenge. The border conflict has inflicted a cost on Indian businesses. And now we have a number and new demands to ease trade with China, which is already at a record high. Our dependence is growing. So what happened to Make in India? Does New Delhi need a new policy? Because your biggest enemy cannot remain your top trading partner. We'll discuss all of this. Meanwhile, Elon Musk has tweeted about banning electronic voting machines, EVMs. And the opposition in India is going to town with it. We'll break it down for you. In the Ukraine Peace Summit, India refuses to sign the joint declaration. We will tell you why. Vietnam is acing its bamboo diplomacy, rolling out the red carpet for Putin while also getting more business from the US. Of course, Washington is not happy about this. The world is spending more on nuclear weapons. What does it mean? Is Khalistani terror casting a shadow on India-US ties? Netanyahu has dissolved Israel's war cabinet. What happens next? Why more and more people are turning away from news? The findings of a new survey. How the US ran a secret campaign against vaccines and face masks during the pandemic. And do aliens live among us? A new study says they do. We'll tell you about it. The headlines first. The Philippines and China face off again in the disputed South China Sea. Manila says Chinese ships rammed and damaged its boats in the waters off the second Thomas Shoal. In recent months, the second Thomas Shoal has seen a number of confrontations between Beijing and Manila. Beijing claims almost the entirety of the South China Sea. In India, at least 9 people killed in a train accident in West Bengal. Around 50 others were also injured after an express train collided with a goods train in Darjeeling. The President, the Prime Minister and the Bengal Chief Minister have expressed condolences. Zimbabwean police arrest opposition leader Jameson Timber. More than 70 other people have also been held for attending a political gathering this weekend. Last year, the opposition faced a wave of arrests after Zimbabwe's disputed election. Adidas shares slide by more than 3% as it confirms a graft probe. The German sportswear giant is investigating allegations that its employees in China embezzled millions of dollars. Traditionally, China has been a very important market for Adidas. And the Hajj pilgrimage ends amid a deadly heat wave in Saudi Arabia. There have been more than a dozen heat-related deaths in Mecca. On Sunday alone, the authorities recorded nearly 3,000 cases of heat exhaustion. Today, the temperature at Mecca's Grand Mosque crossed 51 degrees Celsius. We begin tonight with India's biggest security challenge, which also happens to be India's biggest business partner, China. After years of border tensions and a relentless search for alternatives, India is still hooked to Chinese imports. And the Make in India initiatives are yet to meaningfully mitigate our dependence on Beijing. So what New Delhi needs is a clearer policy, because the cost of not having one is too high. Industry leaders are knocking on the government's doors. They want a more flexible trade policy in India. They want more visas for Chinese workers because their losses are mounting. Consider this. India's electronic manufacturers have prepared a report. They have shared it with various government ministries. Now, this report talks about border tensions between India and China and how it is hurting their business. They say that they've lost some $15 billion in the past 4 years. These are production losses, $15 billion. Plus, there have been layoffs. A total of 100,000 jobs have been cut since 2020. Now, we must also point out that this was also the year when the pandemic began, 2020, and that too would have hit businesses. But the industry here is specifically pointing to tensions with China, and they've underlined 2 pain points. 1, curbs on visas for Chinese workers, and 2, scrutiny of Chinese companies. India has been investigating China's business interests and limiting the entry of Chinese workers. Now the industry in India says that this is hurting their business expansion. The electronics industry has lost potential export deals. This loss is said to be around $10 billion. So trade is a clear casualty of the border standoff. But this is a price that India will have to pay, because the alternative is letting China have its way without any action. You see, the latest round of problems began in 2020 when China escalated border tensions with India. And since then, the PLA, the Chinese army, has ramped up troop presence. They've expanded border infrastructure and committed unprovoked acts of aggression against India. So New Delhi had no choice but to respond. Cutting trade dependencies was part of a broader strategy against China, and the plan did work for a while. For at least 2 years, the US beat China to become India's largest trade partner. But this strategy seems to have run its course because China is now back on top. In the last financial year, Chinese imports to India crossed $100 billion. And what is driving these imports? Critical sectors like technology. This includes smartphone and telecom parts, personal computers and laptops, pharma products, machinery, chemicals, and metals like iron and steel. More than 98% of India's imports were major industrial products. And these are essential imports. Factories and manufacturers need these items to produce goods. So finding alternatives for this supply is going to be challenging, and this dependence on China may last for the foreseeable future. Let me show you another report. It says that India could be rethinking visa rules. Some restrictions could be relaxed, and these changes may benefit Chinese technicians. They could be given faster clearances. This proposal is still under consideration. India has not decided on it yet, but it won't be an easy decision to make. You cannot overlook the needs of the industry. At the same time, you cannot give the Chinese a free pass. As long as their troops remain at the border, it cannot be business as usual with China. So the addiction to Chinese imports is a major vulnerability for India. And it's something that Beijing wants to leverage. Listen to this.
In fact, in recent years, the bilateral trade volume between China and India has continuously exceeded $100 billion, showing a trend of increasing year by year, proving the resilience and potential of trade cooperation between the two countries.
Now, this is something that China often highlights, that border tensions have not affected the overall India-China relationship. They love saying this. So what should New Delhi do? Work on its strategy, set clear rules of engagement, and limit China's involvement in India's economy. In fact, a new policy is being considered. It could become the new template to limit Chinese imports. And we told you about this last week. New Delhi may allow joint ventures between Indian and Chinese companies, but with some conditions. The government could insist on majority shareholding of the Indian partner. So while it's a joint venture, the control remains in Indian hands. And the role of the Chinese partner is limited to, say, some initial funding and technology transfer. The Indian partner should be able to handle the rest. Having said that, in the long term, the aim should be to completely pivot away from Chinese imports. That may require India to rework its trade policy, prioritize exports over imports, and this is a larger issue. It's not just limited to China. Today, India has a trade deficit with its top 9 trading partners. So clearly, a lot more needs to be done on this front to address the larger trade imbalance. And within this, trade ties with China need urgent attention because it has become a key strategic challenge for India. Elon Musk is tweeting again, which can only mean one thing, a major controversy. And this time it is in India. Elon Musk is taking on EVMs, electronic voting machines. He says EVMs can be hacked by humans or artificial intelligence. So what's the solution? Eliminate them, ban them. That's what he's saying. Now, just to be clear, Elon Musk was not talking about India's EVM usage. He was talking about Puerto Rico. It's a US territory in the Caribbean. They too had used EVMs for a primary election. A lot of irregularities were reported there. So Elon Musk says, ban the machines, ban EVMs. Here in India, it's a politically charged issue. The opposition has already been attacking EVMs, and Musk has given them ammunition. Look at what Congress leader Rahul Gandhi is saying. And I'm quoting, EVMs in India are a black box and nobody is allowed to scrutinize them. Democracy ends up becoming a sham and prone to fraud when institutions lack accountability. His allies are also joining in, like Akhilesh Yadav of the Samajwadi Party. He says ban EVMs, start using ballot papers instead. And what is the government saying? Well, nothing so far. But BJP leaders have reacted to Elon Musk, like former IT Minister of India, Rajiv Chandrasekhar. He says Musk is factually incorrect on EVMs. He also says that they cannot be hacked.
I think Elon Musk hasn't understood what the Indian EVM is. The Indian EVM does not lend itself to being hacked because it is precisely a very limited intelligence device. It is a device that only counts the votes and stores the count. To claim that there cannot be any secure electronic or digital product in the world is to then say every Tesla car can be hacked, every calculator can be hacked, every rocket, every aircraft can be hacked.
Now, this is a major issue in India. Even before the elections, EVMs were in focus. A lot of petitions were filed at the Supreme Court, and they asked for two different things. One, to go back to paper ballots, and two, 100% verification of paper trails. You see, every EVM vote has a paper trail. Right now, only a few of them are matched with the EVM tally. But the petition said match all of them, do 100% verification. And what did the Supreme Court of India say? It rejected both the demands. The court reposed faith in the electronic voting machines. But let's keep the legal part aside for now. Let's look at the election results. The ruling party in India failed to get a majority. The opposition made significant gains all over the country. What does that show? That EVMs allowed a free and competitive election. So doubting them is uncalled for. Having said that, there is certainly room for improvement. There can be more transparency, more confidence-building measures, and more oversight. But all of that is for India to decide, not Elon Musk. Which brings us to the core issue here. Yes, he was not talking about Indian EVMs, but he did make a sweeping statement. And look at the sort of power this man has. Elon Musk is the richest person in the world, but the money is not the problem here. The problem is how he uses this position. And I'll give you some recent examples. Last September, he picked a fight with Taiwan. Elon Musk compared Taiwan to Hawaii, basically a self-ruled island to a US state. So naturally, the Taiwanese hit back. They criticized Musk's sweeping statement. Another example was in Ukraine. They used Starlink to run their military operations. In 2022, Musk denied permission. Kiev wanted to strike a Russian base in Crimea, but Musk turned off Starlink. You can argue with Ukraine's strategy and policy, but what happened here was basically Elon Musk sabotaging a Ukrainian attack, and that is again too much power for one man. Recently, he also fought with a Brazilian judge. The judge had blocked far-right X accounts in the country. In response, Elon Musk called him Darth Vader. You can imagine what happened next. Brazil's far-right rallied around Musk. Something similar happened in Australia. The government asked Musk to take down videos of a church attack, but Musk said no. Even the Prime Minister of the country got involved then. He called Elon Musk an arrogant billionaire. Now, do you see the trend here? A, Musk is a loose cannon who fires at will, and B, his words carry heft. People latch on to what Elon Musk says, whether it's the Brazilian opposition or the Russian government or the Indian opposition. And that is, again, too much power for one person. The question is, what can we do about it? Elon Musk's businesses are strategically important ones. SpaceX is revolutionizing space exploration. They're working along with NASA. Tesla is an electric vehicle giant. It makes up almost 20% of global EV sales. And finally, you have X. It's one of the most popular social media platforms. It has more than 550 million active monthly users. And unlike other platforms, X is political. It can shape public opinion. You can't just snatch these companies away from Elon Musk. As long as he owns them, his voice and actions will remain important. But do not worry, all is not lost. There is one country that he never criticizes, and that country is China. Musk never criticizes China. Just consider the pandemic lockdowns. In 2020, Elon Musk's factory in California in America was asked to shut down. He called it a fascist order. But what did he say about China's zero COVID lockdowns? Nothing. Same with tariffs. Joe Biden imposed higher tariffs on Chinese EVs. Most American car makers were happy about it, but guess who isn't? Elon Musk. He says the American tariffs won't help. His media platform X is also banned in China. But Musk says nothing about it. No quip about free speech, no Darth Vader comparisons. What explains this long rope to China? Simple, business. Elon Musk has a huge factory in Shanghai. It produces more than 700,000 vehicles, which is why he does not meddle in China's business. Maybe other countries should do the same. Leverage Elon Musk's business interests to show him his place. He may be the richest person in the world, but no one elected him to make policies.
Volodymyr Zelensky by a summit discussing the basic principles
involving Russia.
Putin put forward a proposal.
Not dividing the circle.
Now let's talk about the summit on peace in Ukraine, the summit that took place this weekend near the Alpine Swiss city of Lucerne. At a 5-star resort situated beside a picturesque lake. Looking at the venue, it seemed like a holiday destination, not the place to find the solution to a war that has dragged on for almost 2.5 years. And in the end, that's what it proved to be. A holiday for world leaders and top diplomats, because there are no real solutions to speak of. The Swiss president gave the closing statement. She mentioned the 3 major points that were agreed upon.
Any use of nuclear energy and nuclear installations must be safe, secured, safeguarded, and environmentally sound. Secondly, food security must not be weaponized in any way. Thirdly, all prisoners of war must be released by complete exchange. All deported and unlawfully displaced Ukrainian children and all other Ukrainian civilians who were unlawfully detained must be returned to Ukraine.
Those were the 3 major talking points. Ukraine's nuclear power plants must be kept safe, Kiev should be allowed to export food, and all Ukrainians who are in Russia must be sent back home. Most of the countries who attended the summit agreed to these broad points. But the focus was on the elephant in the room, or rather the bear missing from the room. Russia, one of the 2 warring parties, was not at this summit. And what does that mean for this Swiss declaration? The points agreed to after 2 days of tough negotiations. It means that all of this was pointless. Some of the participants understood this, like India, Brazil, South Africa, and Saudi Arabia. They refused to sign the final declaration because it was meaningless without Russia's participation. In fact, India's statement summed it up.
In our view, only those options acceptable to both parties can lead to abiding peace. In line with this approach, we have decided to avoid association with the joint communiqué or any other document emerging from this summit.
Now, India and the Global South knew this before the summit started. They did send delegations to attend, but just diplomats, not heads of state, because they knew that it would be a waste of time, and Russia noted this. This is what the Kremlin spokesperson said about the skeptical participants.
Many of them, and this was a common point of view at this event, confirmed the understanding of the futility of any serious, substantive discussions without the presence of our country. We also noted this. Well, in general, of course, if we talk about the effectiveness of this meeting, then of course it approaches 0.
It may sound harsh, but it's on point. If Russia isn't losing the war, if it isn't suing for peace, then why would Moscow accept terms it hasn't helped draft? All of this posturing in the Swiss Alps is futile because at the end of the day, it won't affect Russia in the slightest. Moscow will keep waging its war, Ukrainian soldiers will keep fighting, and world leaders will keep wringing their hands and giving sermons while enjoying the finest hospitality, of course. Let's look at the real winners of this Swiss summit. The Bergenstock Resort, they just got a great deal of free publicity and funds from the Swiss government, no doubt, for the food and services that they provided. And they aren't alone. There are also Swiss artists who came up with this little installation. It says, Ukraine. Excellent use of taxpayer money. The whole event seems to have been about two things: boosting Swiss tourism and sending a message. Not to Russia, because they couldn't care less. The message was for a different audience. And the Swiss president let the cat out of the bag.
Here we are sending a clear signal to the people of Ukraine and to all those directly affected by the consequences of the war. A large part of the international community has the desire to bring change.
So the event was to boost Ukrainian morale, to convince them to not throw down their arms. You know what this looks like? The people of Ukraine being used as cannon fodder and the West cheering them on. If they really wanted peace, they would stop with these theatrics and instead bring Russia to the negotiating table. Unless that happens, these summits are just a waste of time and money. Now let's look at Russia's President Vladimir Putin. He seems least concerned about the Swiss summit. Putin has bigger things on his mind than some lakeside retreat for Western leaders. He is looking at real diplomacy and a chance to shore up old friendships. The Russian president is on a 3-day tour to two friendly countries, North Korea and Vietnam. Now, if this was 50 years ago, this trip would have been normal. Moscow reaffirming ties with its fellow communist nations. But in 2024, the visit is raising eyebrows. North Korea is a pariah state. No one visits Pyongyang. Even Putin last went to this country 24 years ago. Now he's going again tomorrow. So it's important. And then he heads to Vietnam, which is an even more significant destination, and the one that we'll focus on tonight, Vietnam, because the dynamics are very different compared to 50 years ago. Today, Vietnam is no longer a Western enemy. In fact, it's the opposite. Hanoi is a Western darling. It sounds strange, considering the country is still a single-party communist state. Irrespective, Vietnam is being courted by the West. Last year, US President Joe Biden went to Vietnam. He upgraded US-Vietnam ties to the level of comprehensive strategic partnership. And remember, this is the same Vietnam that the US went to war with, the same ruling Communist Party that Washington tried so hard to crush. So what brought about this U-turn? You could say China. China is now a top adversary of the West, and Vietnam is seen as an alternative, a way to de-risk from China, to reduce Western reliance on Beijing. It won't be easy to do because labor is cheap in China. For decades, the West exploited this. They outsourced their manufacturing jobs to China. They benefited from Beijing's lack of labor laws. It seemed like a win-win. Western companies saved money and China saw rapid growth. But now it has become a threat. And the West has woken up to its mistake, so it is belatedly trying to find alternatives to Beijing. A lot of Asian nations are in contention, but Vietnam is a front runner to become China's replacement. It is already benefiting from the West versus China divide, drawing in sizable investments from former adversaries like the United States of America. Vietnam is also playing it smart. It isn't getting carried away. It knows that the West can be a fickle friend, so it won't abandon its old allies, like Moscow, no matter how much Washington wants it to. When news of Putin's trip broke, the US was furious. Look at the statement from their embassy in Vietnam, and I'm quoting, "No country should give Putin a platform to promote his war of aggression and otherwise allow him to normalize his atrocities. If he is able to travel freely, it could normalize Russia's blatant violations of international law." This is from the US Embassy spokesperson in Vietnam. It was a strong statement, a strong rebuke, a mark of protest against Vietnam for inviting Putin. But Hanoi is not likely to care. It is busy readying the red carpet for the Russian president. There's a buzz in the air, and a lot of Vietnamese people are excited.
Having Putin visit us here is a very interesting opportunity, but I can only hope that when in my country, he could see that Russia's products are being well sold in Vietnam, and that the Vietnamese people love Russian products very much, simply because they are very good.
President Putin's visit to Vietnam is like the opening of a new page for our country. And I also hope that the friendship between our two countries will become closer and closer and bond together even further.
Vietnam and Russia share a number of bonds, people-to-people ties, trade relations, and even arms agreements. Russia is still Vietnam's largest arms supplier. It's a relationship that has existed for decades, back when the West was still trying to destroy Hanoi. So, of course, Vietnam would welcome Putin. The visit strengthens Vietnam's hand and reinforces the country's strategic autonomy. The West wants them to be an alternative to China, while Russia wants them to be a valuable trade partner. Vietnam can fulfill both these roles and profit by doing so. It's what they call bamboo diplomacy, where they can bend in every direction without breaking, balancing competing geopolitical interests, like a bamboo plant with strong roots and flexible branches. Vietnam looks set to follow this mantra, much to the annoyance of the US.
यहाँ मतलब हम लोग जब सुबह की आज तो हम लोग का बकरा ईद है। जब हम लोग नमाज पढ़ के बाहर निकले तो हम लोग को मतलब खबर आया कि हमारे यहाँ 2 किलोमीटर अंदर एक ट्रेन दुर्घटना हुई है। तो हम लोग जो है मतलब इसको तो लाइव नहीं देखा, हम लोग सुना, फिर जाकर मतलब जब हम लोग को पता चला फिर हम लोग यहाँ स्पॉट आके अभी देख रहे हैं। ये तो जो है बहुत
क्या देख रहे हैं आप, क्या नजर
यहाँ तो मतलब जो है एक ट्रेन शायद खड़ी हुई थी और एक ट्रेन आके जो है इनसे टकरा गई शायद।
एक ही लाइन पे, एक ही पटरी पे था?
जी हाँ, एक ही पटरी पे शायद एक ट्रेन खड़ी थी या जा रही थी, शायद स्लो थी, और मतलब एक ट्रेन आ रही थी, आके जो है मतलब ऐसी दुर्घटना हुई है शायद।
जब ये घटना घटी तब टाइम हो रहा था अप्रॉक्स 8:35 मॉर्निंग। तो जितना हम लोग को पता चला, सामने कंचना जो एक्सप्रेस है वो धीरे गति से चल रहा था, वो खड़ा नहीं था, धीरे गति चल रहा था। पीछे से जो मालगाड़ी है वो अचानक बहुत स्पीड से था, वो आके पीछे से मर दिया उसको।
तो क्या एक ही ट्रैक पे हुआ है?
एक ही ट्रैक पे दो ट्रेन एक ही ट्रैक पे आ गया। अचानक देखिए इतना आवाज हुआ था, यहाँ पे जो लोकेलिटी जितना सब है सब आके इसके ऊपर इसमें लग गया। स्पॉट डेड हम लोगों को जितना पता चला 5-6 जन यहाँ पे रेस्क्यू किया गया है। अभी भी अब देख सकते हैं कि अभी जस्ट नाउ एक जन को रेस्क्यू करके गया।
जो बाहर निकला हुआ उसको ले जाइए।
Is the world on the brink of a nuclear war again? We ask because the world is spending more on nuclear weapons. A new report is out. It says that countries spent more than $91 billion on nuclear weapons. This was in 2023. This year, the figure looks set to cross $100 billion. More countries are conducting nuclear drills, more nuclear weapons are on standby, more warheads are being kept on high operational alert. All of this points in one direction, that the world is preparing for nuclear offensives. And while most players talk about a no first use policy, the current situation makes our world like a tinderbox. One wrong move could lead to a catastrophe. Our next report has more.
$91 billion. That's what countries spent on nuclear weapons in 2023. It's up by almost $11 billion from 2022. And that's because of a lot of things. 2 wars, multiple global conflicts, and general geopolitical uncertainty. All of that is driving global spending on nukes. Leading the list is the United States. It spent over $51 billion on nuclear weapons. China is the second largest spender. It spent nearly $11 billion on nukes. Russia is the third largest spender at $8.3 billion, followed by the United Kingdom and France. Where exactly is this money going? It's being used to strengthen the nuclear arsenal of countries. the number of operational nuclear warheads is steadily rising. In January, 12,121 warheads were recorded worldwide. Out of this, 9,585 are part of military stockpiles. That means they are ready for potential use. 2,100 of the deployed warheads are in a state of high operational alert. Most of them belong to Russia or the US. China, too, is keeping warheads on high operational alert for the first time. So what explains this increased spending on nukes? In 1945, the US dropped atomic bombs on Japan. There was widespread destruction and an outcry against nuclear weapons. The US was the only country then with nukes. So soon, other nations started developing their own. The belief was that once a lot of nations had nukes, none of them would use it. It would act as a deterrent. But another school of thought says that this also raises the possibility of a nuclear war. It's been 8 decades since the United States attacked Japan. Now, 9 countries have nuclear weapons, at least officially on paper. But thankfully, no nuclear attack has happened since Hiroshima. There has been nuclear posturing, threats to use nukes, but no attack. But does this increased spending mean that the world could soon be on the brink of a nuclear crisis? Take Russia, for example. Vladimir Putin has repeatedly brought up his country's nuclear arsenal. Russia also began a series of exercises simulating the use of tactical nuclear weapons near Ukraine. On the other side, there's NATO. It is in talks to deploy more nuclear weapons. NATO members are mulling taking the nukes out of storage and placing them on standby. Which brings us to the question, can we ever live in a world without nuclear weapons? In 2017, this seemed possible. 100 countries endorsed a UN treaty to ban nukes, but nuclear-armed nations objected. And since then, the spending on nukes is only growing. In the last 5 years, global spending on nuclear weapons is up by 34%. By the end of 2024, the world would have spent over $100 billion on nukes. Earlier this year, the United Nations chief said, "A nuclear war must never be waged because a nuclear war can never be won." But are some countries looking to wage one? Or is this just mere posturing? We don't have an answer for it, but one thing is certain. The goal was to ensure a world without nukes. But as countries spend more and more money on them, that's unlikely to happen anytime soon.
Our next story is about the India-US relationship. Is there trouble in paradise? They've had a fabulous run in the last decade. The relations went from strength to strength. But is there a slowdown now? I'll tell you why I ask. The Pannu assassination case has a new development. And we've covered this story before. Gurpatwant Singh Pannu is a Khalistani separatist. He's based in the city of New York. The US says there was a plot to assassinate him. By whom? And according to them, India. Last year, they charged an Indian citizen in this case. His name is Nikhil Gupta. Gupta was arrested in Prague last year. He's now been extradited to the United States. Right now, he is in a jail in Brooklyn. And what happens next? Gupta will be produced in front of a court. I'm sure investigators will question him, and based on his testimony, a case will be built. Now, Gupta's role is key. He's a bit like the middleman. The US says that Indian officials used him to hire a hitman. So what he says, what Gupta says, will be important both legally and diplomatically. India has already rejected these allegations. An internal probe is also underway, but we won't focus too much on the legal case in the US. That's for the Americans to figure out. Tonight, let's focus on the politics. How will this case impact relations? Well, a senior US official is visiting India as we speak. His name is Jake Sullivan, the US National Security Advisor. Sullivan held some important meetings today. He met his Indian counterpart Ajit Doval, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, and finally Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He met all of them. Now, Sullivan is like Biden's troubleshooter. He gets the difficult stuff done. In fact, Jake Sullivan was the first to raise this issue with India. It happened back in August 2023. Saudi Arabia was hosting a summit on the Ukraine war. Some 40 countries attended this summit. Doval and Sullivan met on the sidelines. That's the first time when Washington raised the issue of Pannu. the assassination plot. And now Jake Sullivan is back. So just look at the timeline. On June 14th, Nikhil Gupta was extradited to the US. On June 17, Jake Sullivan landed in India. The question is, what happens next? Will this episode affect India-US relations? Let's put this whole thing in context. 2023 was a great year for this relationship. Biden invited Modi to Washington for a state visit. The US also agreed to share strategic technology with India, like jet engines and killer drones. But beneath the optics, some issues remained. One was India's ties with Russia, its refusal to criticize Moscow's invasion. And second, the lectures. The US has repeatedly commented on India's internal matters, like the violence in Manipur or the arrest of Delhi's chief minister. But India was not swayed. The government confidently brushed the lectures aside. In that context, the Pannu plot is a gift for Washington. They can use it to put pressure on India. Of course, a lot of this is conjecture. Whether the US is actually doing it is a different question. Nonetheless, how should India deal with this case? Well, there are two parts to it. The first is containing this particular case, whether it's coordinating with the Americans or sharing information or keeping the investigation low-key, not making a spectacle out of it. And leadership will matter in this effort. Prime Minister Modi did have a meeting with Joe Biden in Italy. It was not a full-fledged bilateral. It was a short pull aside, not enough to discuss such major issues. And another key meeting may not materialize anytime soon because Biden is now entering campaign season. His full focus will be on domestic US politics, which brings us to the second strategy: better messaging on Khalistan. Indians know how dangerous this movement is. Unfortunately, the rest of the world does not know, or if they do, they don't agree or acknowledge, especially countries in the West. They have become breeding grounds for Khalistanis. So India must combat it smartly. Sharp and loud reactions have not helped very much. So maybe India should try some quiet diplomacy now, like sharing more information on Khalistani terrorists. Also narrative building, raising the issue at UN bodies, and educating foreign citizens on this threat. It certainly won't be easy. The West thinks that Khalistanis are dissidents or critics. India must show them that Khalistanis are not dissidents, they are violent separatists and terrorists, and this should be a major priority for the new government. If not, the gains of the last decades could be lost. Our next story is about Benjamin Netanyahu. His country is at war, and so is the Israeli Prime Minister. He's fighting on multiple fronts. And today he's making headlines for his political battles. Netanyahu has dissolved the war cabinet. It was a multi-party group that was formed when the Gaza war began to hold wider consultations on how to fight the war. But a few days back, opposition leader Benny Gantz quit. He left the war cabinet. Others wanted to join, like Netanyahu's allies. There was a lot of push and pull, but the Prime Minister disbanded the cabinet. This gives him more room to exercise control. It also exposes his isolation in Israeli politics and the divide in his country. So much so that Netanyahu is now publicly criticizing the Israeli army. Our next report tells you what this means for Israel.
It was the 11th of October 2023. Israel was united. Its leaders enraged.
An attack whose savagery I can say we have not seen since the Holocaust.
Just days ago, Hamas had attacked the country. Its citizens were taken hostage. The government, the opposition, the army, they were all on the same page. They wanted just one thing: bring back the hostages and end Hamas. Israel was at war, so its leaders joined hands across party lines. They formed what was known as the War Cabinet. It consisted of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Opposition Leader Benny Gantz, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, Israeli Minister Ron Dermer, former IDF Chief of Staff Gadi Eisenkot, and the Shas Party leader Aryeh Deri. It was a cabinet that represented all voices in Israel. But 8 months later, Israel's war cabinet has been dissolved. Why? because the war in Gaza has divided Israel and its war cabinet. Earlier this month, Benny Gantz quit the war cabinet. He said it's because of a lack of clarity. Gantz wanted answers on what a post-war Gaza would look like. He asked Netanyahu for the answers, but he got none. That led him to quitting the war cabinet. Soon after, Netanyahu's far-right allies made new demands. They wanted to join the war cabinet. They wanted a place on the decision table. But Netanyahu would have none of it. Including them in the war cabinet would put him more at the mercy of his far-right allies. And that's something that the Israeli Prime Minister doesn't want. So he decided to dissolve it altogether. It's clearly a snub to his far-right allies, especially Itamar Ben-Gvir, Israel's security minister. But will this impact the war in Gaza? It's unlikely. Instead of the war cabinet, Netanyahu will now consult his group of ministers. Decision-making will happen at the security cabinet. Key decisions will most likely be taken by Netanyahu and his own advisors. So it will be business as usual. But it's not the only problem the Israeli Prime Minister has. On Sunday, Israel's military announced a daily pause in fighting. It would take place in the Rafah area. The pause would begin at 8 a.m. local time and would continue until 7 p.m. Why? To facilitate the passage of aid to the area. So it was an 11-hour humanitarian pause. But it did not go down too well with Benjamin Netanyahu. He apparently criticized the decision, calling it unacceptable. This new clash between Netanyahu and the Israeli army comes amid a rift between Netanyahu and top IDF commanders. The divisions have become so pronounced that Netanyahu even criticized the military publicly, an extremely rare move. He said, and I quote, "We have a country with an army, not an army with a country." It puts Israel in a precarious position. This is a country that has been at war for over 8 months. Over 600 Israeli soldiers have been killed. Many of its hostages are still in Hamas captivity. And its allies, both at home and abroad, are displeased with Israel's actions. The last thing Netanyahu needs is a full-blown conflict with the army. That too in the middle of a war.
Our next story is about the news. We report it, you consume it. That's been the equation for decades. But now people are turning away from the news. Apparently, they find it boring and depressing. Says who? A new study. It was conducted by the Oxford University. More than 90,000 adults were surveyed from 47 countries, so a fairly good sample size. And what did they find? 39% people actively avoid the news. 39%, this number was just 29% back in 2017. So it's risen by 10% in 6 years. Let's look at some other numbers as well. 46% people are extremely interested in the news. This number was 63% in 2017. So the big picture is quite clear. More people are turning away from the news. The question is why? Apparently it's too boring, relentless and depressing. Now, at the outset, let me say this. We understand the sentiment. We also respect the feedback. But tonight, we are putting these numbers in context, basically telling our side of the story. And we can't deny that news is depressing. There are 2 major wars in the world. Wealth inequality is rising, food insecurity is surging, and civil wars are hurting daily lives. That is not a propaganda spin. That is the reality of our planet. Yes, the pictures and numbers are depressing. But what else should the news media do? Should we not report all this? Well, the culprits would love that. Israel would love it if the media stopped covering the war in Gaza. No reportage, no outrage. China would love it if we stopped talking about Xinjiang. The US would love it if we don't talk about Libya or Afghanistan. But that is not the solution. If the news is depressing, it's a reflection of our world. Blaming or challenging or cancelling the messenger won't help. Now we come to the boring part of it. Is news really that boring? The report says it is. Apparently, there is too much politics in the news, and we agree to some extent. News media does focus too much on politicians. It becomes a who said what situation. maybe other genres can be explored, like emerging technologies or feel-good stories or even science and health. Things that trigger conversations and impact our lives. Having said that, you cannot eliminate politics. And that's where leaders also matter. How do you make an 81-year-old president interesting? How do you make parliamentary logjam less boring? Perhaps the answer lies in packaging. News has not really changed since the 2000s. The same old format, the same old style of graphics, and the same old stories. Compare that to other forms of media, like music or movies. The packaging has improved a lot more, and there's a reason why. The money. News media is not exactly a money spinner. Let's look at the US market, which is the biggest in the world. They have lost 1/3 of their newspapers since 2005, 1/3. Last year, more than 2 newspapers shut down every week. And shutdowns also mean layoffs. America has lost 2/3 of its newspaper journalists since the year 2005. What explains this? A big reason is dipping advertisement revenue. Just look at the New York Times. Their ad revenue fell 8.4% last year. And still the New York Times managed to make some profit. But the Washington Post did not. They lost around $100 million. Same with television channels. CNN lost 39% of their ad revenue in the first half of 2023. Fox News lost 36% of their ad revenue. So my point is quite simple. Even the biggest media companies are struggling the world over. If money doesn't come from ads, where will it come from? Paid subscriptions are one option, but how many of you pay for news? According to the same survey, very few people. Only 17% people paid for their news. It's barely changed from the last survey. 55% people say they will not pay for news. Only 2% will pay the actual subscription amount. Most others want steep discounts. So where will expansion come from? Where will new ideas come from? You pay for Netflix. You pay for Amazon. Yet very few of you want to pay for the news. Unless this changes, there is no scope to expand, to try new things. So while we take the feedback from the viewer, we also have a request. Don't avoid the news. Tell us how to make it better. Which stories do you want to see? How do you want to see them? And how much will you pay for them? Because news cannot be a one-way street. Here is another reason why we need reliable news. Misinformation is rampant in our world, and some of it comes from state actors. Let me give you the latest example. And this is a shocking revelation. It's about what the US did during the pandemic. The Americans ran a secret campaign in the Philippines. They created fake social media accounts, and they amplified misinformation against face masks and vaccines. It was a coordinated campaign. The US military was behind it. The aim was to discredit Chinese supplies, but in the process, the Americans ended up putting a lot of lives in danger. Our next report has more details.
Just like the rest of the world, the Philippines was hit hard by the pandemic. Its people endured one of the world's longest lockdowns and the loss of countless lives. While the health workers were waging a tough fight against an invisible enemy, another silent threat was rearing its head. On social media, posts like these began to pop up. It says, China is the virus, COVID came from China, and the vaccine came from China. The post dates back to July 2020. There were more like these. At least 300 accounts were sharing more disinformation about China's pandemic supplies. The US military was running these accounts. They were a part of a clandestine operation. It began during the presidency of Donald Trump in 2020. His successor Joe Biden extended it till spring 2021. The operation was designed as a psychological campaign. It purely aimed at discrediting the supply of face masks, testing kits, and vaccines from China. Here's how it was executed. The operation was planned at the Pentagon, the headquarters of the US Department of Defense. The US military Psychological Operations Center in Florida's Tampa executed it. It's unclear if the American campaign was effective, but there's no doubt it was dangerous. There was a high degree of vaccine hesitancy in the Philippines. People didn't trust the shots. They refused to go to vaccination centers. Frustrated by the slow progress, the then President Rodrigo Duterte resorted to issuing threats.
You choose vaccine or I will have you jailed. You get vaccinated, otherwise I will order all the village heads to have a tally of all the people who refuse to get vaccinated. Because if not, I will inject them with ivermectin, which is intended for pigs.
It wasn't just the Philippines. The disinformation campaign had a wide-ranging mandate. The US military was authorized to target the Chinese social media in a similar fashion. A series of fake accounts were created to influence public opinion against the Chinese government. The American military expanded their PSYOP against the Chinese in West Asia and Central Asia as well. In one instance, they targeted the Muslims in these regions by pushing this theory. China's Sinovac shot was made with pork gelatin, and taking it could be considered haram or forbidden under Islamic law. Ultimately, the Chinese vaccines were proven to be ineffective, but America's campaign has given fresh ammo to Beijing.
We have noted the relevant reports. Facts have repeatedly proven that the US has been manipulating social media to spread false information, influencing public opinion to smear the image of other countries. This is a consistent practice by the US, and China is firmly opposed to it.
Despite this, the US remains defiant. Reports say the Pentagon has no plans to end its propaganda efforts. In fact, it plans to double down.
कंचन गाड़ी का एक्सीडेंट हो गया रास्ते में सवारियों को निकालते हुए
बेड़ा मर गया
देखिए तो भाई सामने में कौन तो
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. From Gaza to Indonesia, Muslims across the globe celebrate Eid. Pandas in Beijing, in a Beijing zoo, receive ice cubes to beat the heat. And 3D printed houses help address the housing crisis in Kenya. Finally, we're taking you back in history. On this day in 1885, the Statue of Liberty arrived in New York City. It was a gift to America from France. The statue arrived in 350 different pieces in more than 200 boxes. Then it was reassembled and displayed as a symbol of freedom and democracy in the United States. We're leaving you on that note. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Hello and welcome to the late night edition with me, Ayushman Singh Jamwal. Ladies and gentlemen, big breaking news coming in at the top of the bulletin, where Home Minister Amit Shah chaired a high-level meeting on Manipur to review the security situation in the state with senior officials from various agencies. The Home Minister has said the government will initiate talks with Cookies and Meiteis